journal slipped from my hands the moment I loosened its broken spine. Instead of written pages spilling across my workshop floor, dozens of neatly cut paper stubs fluttered into the light like pale leaves, proving someone had removed every single page years before I ever opened it. My daughter stood frozen in the doorway, whispering that Mom's illness must have kept her from writing anything at all. I wanted to believe her. Then I tilted the supposedly blank cover beneath my work lamp and saw thousands of faint impressions pressed into the remaining paper. The first sentence slowly appeared where no ink remained. It wasn't goodbye. It simply read, "Never tell them my name." If you've ever discovered that silence can carry more love than words, stay with me for a little while. Until that afternoon, I believed grief had already taken everything Eleanor could leave behind. I had spent 31 years in the Navy managing shore facilities, where damaged buildings usually surrendered their history one careful layer at a time. Pipes left stains, beams held old measurements, and repaired walls remembered every mistake hidden beneath fresh paint. Retirement had changed my address, not the habit of looking closely before accepting the obvious. That's why our daughter Emily brought the journal to me instead of donating it with the rest of Eleanor's belongings. The leather cover had split along the binding during probate, and Emily knew I had repaired enough family Bibles and photo albums to make fragile things useful again. She set the journal gently on my bench before quietly saying, "I wish Mom had written something at the end." I reached across the table and squeezed her hand. Maybe she wanted us to remember what she already said. Emily nodded without answering, though disappointment lingered in her eyes. We both believed the same story. Eleanor had purchased the journal shortly after learning her illness could shorten her future. We assumed she meant to leave letters behind, but grew too weak before writing the first page. That explanation comforted everyone because it required nothing more from the living. After Emily returned home, I carried the journal beneath my adjustable lamp and removed the cracked thread holding the spine together. That was when the trimmed page stubs drifted onto my bench. No decay could produce cuts that clean. Someone had deliberately removed every written page while carefully preserving the covers. My first thought shamed me. Had Eleanor destroyed her own final words? I rejected the idea almost immediately, because she had never hidden difficult conversations from me. Then curiosity replaced sorrow. Rotating the remaining paper beneath the lamp revealed shallow grooves crossing the blank end sheets. Years of handwriting had pressed through enough layers to leave tiny valleys the naked eye almost missed. I traced one line without touching it. Letters emerged only in the changing shadow, incomplete yet unmistakable. "Never tell them my name." I stared until the workshop grew dark around the single circle of light, realizing my wife's last journal had never been empty at all. Someone had only wanted it to appear that way. The next morning, I carried the journal to the oldest building in town that still smelled of paper instead of computers. Margaret Hale had spent nearly 40 years restoring rare books before retiring, and although arthritis had finally persuaded her to leave conservation work behind, she still volunteered twice a week in the library's local history room. She greeted me with the patient smile of someone who had learned long ago that damaged books often arrived carrying damaged hearts. I never mentioned hidden messages over the telephone because extraordinary discoveries deserved careful eyes before hopeful words. Margaret adjusted a movable lamp over the journal without speaking for several minutes. She rotated the covers, examined the trimmed page stubs through a magnifier, and finally looked at me instead of the paper. "These pages weren't lost," she said quietly. "I was afraid you'd say that. They were removed one gathering at a time with a binding knife." "You mean carefully?" She nodded. "Very carefully." That answer surprised me more than the missing pages themselves. Whoever removed them had protected the remaining structure instead of destroying it. The journal had not been vandalized. It had been deliberately preserved. Margaret lowered the room lights and positioned a broad beam across the blank end sheets at a shallow angle. Faint valleys emerged like ripples in fresh snow. "There they are," she whispered. She placed a transparent film above the page and slowly traced the deepest impressions without touching the paper itself. Little by little, incomplete words surfaced from shadows that ordinary light concealed. Most remained unreadable. One phrase did not. Mrs. Alvarez never knew. Another appeared beneath it. "Please let it stay that way." Neither sentence sounded like a farewell. Both sounded like instructions. Margaret leaned back in thoughtful silence. "These impressions were made over many years," she finally said. "What makes you think that?" "The pressure changes. The handwriting becomes steadier, then weaker, then steadier again. Different pens, different paper beneath. This wasn't one final journal." "It wasn't?" "No." She rested one finger beside the damaged spine. "This was probably rewritten many times." The explanation unsettled me. Emily believed Eleanor had simply been too ill to write. I had begun believing someone stole her final thoughts. Margaret offered a third possibility. Perhaps Eleanor herself had copied years of private writing into one journal before removing every page intentionally. As I carefully closed the cover, something slipped from the cracked hinge and floated onto the table. A pressed lavender leaf. Perfectly preserved. I recognized it immediately. Every anniversary, Eleanor tucked fresh lavender into one of her books before pressing it flat for the following year. She once told me dried flowers remembered seasons better than photographs. I smiled despite myself. Margaret noticed. "That means something. It always did." She handed me a small archival envelope before the leaf could crumble. "Keep it safe." Then she looked back at the journal. "If we continue, we'll recover more impressions." "But," she hesitated, "sometimes forgotten writing remains hidden because its owner intended it to." On the drive home, I couldn't decide which frightened me more, discovering Eleanor's greatest secret, or discovering she had trusted me to find it only after she was gone. That evening, while examining the back cover beneath my workshop lamp, another faint line finally revealed itself between two overlapping impressions. This one was clearer than anything we had recovered before. "The promise isn't finished yet." The easiest thing would have been telling everyone what Margaret and I had found. Emily deserved answers, and the County Historical Society would have gladly celebrated any newly discovered record Eleanor had left behind. Instead, I did something that even surprised me. I closed the journal, placed it back inside its worn archival box, and quietly thanked Victor Lang for offering to help preserve Eleanor's memory. From the outside, it looked as though I had accepted his idea without hesitation. Inside, I had decided not to trust anyone with conclusions I had not yet earned. Victor invited me to the Historical Society the following afternoon. He welcomed me warmly, pouring coffee into two mismatched mugs while admiring the journal's weathered leather cover. "Eleanor always appreciated local history," he said. "She appreciated people more." He smiled politely. "History is how people survive." His answer sounded thoughtful, yet something about it felt rehearsed. Victor carefully turned the journal in his hands, without attempting to open it. If those pages can be reconstructed, he continued, our anniversary exhibition would be the perfect place to share them. Maybe. It would honor her. I'll think about it. Technically, every word I spoke was true. I simply failed to mention that the recovered impressions already suggested Eleanor wanted the opposite. Leaving the Historical Society, I drove directly to Margaret's home, instead of returning to mine. She had assembled a portable raking light frame that allowed us to photograph the impressions from multiple angles before combining the images. My years maintaining Navy facilities had taught me that damaged blueprints often revealed hidden measurements when examined under different lighting conditions. Paper behaved much the same way. For 3 patient hours, we captured image after image. Most fragments remained incomplete. Then, several disconnected sentences finally aligned. Delivered groceries after the storm. Mrs. Alvarez believes they came from the church. Please never correct her. Margaret quietly removed her glasses. She documented kindness, so it seems, but not her own. I nodded slowly. Every recovered sentence described generosity while deliberately hiding the giver. At first, I believed Eleanor had been recording anonymous charity performed by many different people throughout town. The conclusion fit everything we had recovered. It also turned out to be wrong. As Margaret adjusted the final photograph, another impression emerged near the edge where torn pages had once rested. Unlike the earlier entries, this one appeared formatted almost like an index. Dates. Initials. Tiny page numbers. Someone had organized the journal before removing its contents. Beside one entry appeared a notation neither of us expected. Transfer completed. Transfer of what? I asked. Margaret studied the impression for a long moment. I don't know. Neither did I. If Eleanor had merely documented anonymous acts of compassion, why would she record transfers? The word belonged in an inventory ledger, not a private journal. Driving home beneath a gray autumn sky, I realized my first theory had collapsed. The journal wasn't simply remembering kindness. It was tracking something that continued moving from one person to another. That evening, Emily called. I heard Victor spoke with you. He did. He thinks Mom's journal could become the centerpiece of the Society's exhibition. I looked toward the journal resting unopened on my workbench. Maybe it could. Silence filled the line before Emily answered. I think Mom would have hated being the center of anything. So do I. When we ended the call, I returned to the workshop and slid a thin sheet of black paper beneath the journal's back cover. One final impression rose into view with startling clarity. The promise belongs to Rebecca now. I had never heard Eleanor mention anyone named Rebecca. I spent most of the following day looking for a woman named Rebecca, only to discover how little I actually knew about the promise Eleanor had been protecting. Church directories listed 4 women with that first name. Library volunteers remembered 2 more who had moved away years earlier. None connected naturally to the fragments hidden inside the journal. By sunset, I had gathered more names than answers, and for the first time since opening the damaged binding, I wondered whether I had mistaken coincidence for intention. Margaret reminded me that evidence should guide the story, never the other way around. She was right, but patience had become harder now that Eleanor's unfinished promise seemed to belong to someone still living. That evening, Margaret asked me to bring every photograph we had taken of the journal. Instead of studying individual sentences, She arranged the enlarged images across her dining room table according to pressure depth rather than visible wording. I frowned. I thought we were reading the writing. We are, she answered. Then why ignore the words? Because impressions reveal habits as well as language. Slowly, she pointed to subtle differences I had overlooked. The earliest entries pressed deeply into the paper. Later ones became lighter. Near the final impressions, however, the writing suddenly grew firm again. Her strength returned? I asked. Margaret gently shook her head. No. She placed two enlarged photographs side by side. The pen angle changes. I looked closer. It did. The last entries weren't written while holding the journal in her lap, Margaret continued. They were written on a solid table. A memory surfaced immediately. During Eleanor's final months, she could barely sit comfortably at our kitchen table. She almost always wrote while resting in her favorite chair. Whoever wrote the last pages had worked somewhere else. For a moment, my stomach tightened. Someone else finished her journal. It was the first conclusion that made complete sense. The stronger handwriting, the different writing angle, the removed pages. Someone must have honored Eleanor's wishes after she died by copying her remaining notes before taking them away. I almost accepted the theory. Then Margaret quietly handed me the pressed lavender leaf. Look underneath. Tiny brown fibers clung to its stem. Not paper. Linen. The same pale linen thread Eleanor always used when rebinding treasured books. Margaret smiled sadly. Your first theory was closer. I looked at her in confusion. Eleanor rebound this journal herself. The realization stopped me cold. She had not merely written in the journal. She had dismantled it, reassembled it, pressed the lavender inside, removed every page, then left only the impressions behind. None of that could have happened after her death. The blank journal was never an accident. It was a carefully constructed message. Every assumption Emily and I had shared collapsed in a single moment. Eleanor had never intended anyone to read the original pages. She intended someone to recover only what remained after they were gone. The central question changed instantly. I was no longer asking who removed the journal. I was asking why Eleanor trusted hidden impressions more than actual words. Before I left Margaret's house, she unfolded one final enlarged photograph we had ignored because almost none of its writing seemed legible. Viewed upside down beneath angled light, several overlapping impressions unexpectedly aligned. Only one complete sentence emerged. If you're reading this, the exhibition has already been proposed. I stared at Margaret. Neither of us had ever mentioned Victor Lang. Neither of us had discussed the Historical Society's anniversary exhibition while Eleanor was alive. Yet somehow she had anticipated it. 6 days remained before the exhibition committee voted. For the first time, I realized I wasn't simply uncovering Eleanor's secret. I was following instructions she had prepared specifically for me. The closer I came to understanding Eleanor's intentions, the less certain I became that I deserved to uncover them. During 38 years of marriage, she had never hidden ordinary truths from me. Yet this journal had been designed to reveal itself only after she was gone. That realization carried a quiet accusation I could not escape. Perhaps she believed I would try to protect her reputation instead of respecting her wishes. Perhaps she knew me better than I knew myself. The following morning, Victor Lang called before breakfast. His voice sounded unusually cheerful. "Charles, wonderful news. The exhibition committee voted to expand the Eleanor Monroe section. I didn't know they had already met. They moved the schedule forward." That small change immediately unsettled me. The deadline Eleanor had anticipated was arriving sooner than expected. Victor continued speaking. "We'll need the journal within 48 hours so our archivists can begin preparing the display. I haven't decided. I'm sure Eleanor would have wanted people inspired." After we ended the call, I noticed something I had ignored for days. The archival envelope containing the pressed lavender leaf had been opened. I knew I had sealed it before leaving Margaret's house. The flap now rested loosely against the paper. Inside, the lavender remained. Something else did not. A narrow strip of folded tissue paper that Margaret had used to cushion the stem was gone. At first, I dismissed the difference as my own mistake. Then I searched every folder inside the archival box. Nothing. Margaret arrived an hour later and immediately recognized my expression. "What's missing?" "The tissue," she frowned. "That's impossible." Together we searched the workshop without success. The tissue itself held no financial value, yet Margaret quietly explained why it mattered. Before placing the lavender inside the envelope, she had wrapped it using a conservation sheet on which she had penciled tiny reference numbers matching every recovered photograph. Without those numbers, the exact sequence of several overlapping impressions became far harder to verify. The evidence still existed. Its organization did not. Someone had taken only the one item capable of slowing our reconstruction. Emily stopped by that afternoon carrying homemade soup. I almost told her everything. Instead, I hesitated. Victor had already spoken with her. "He says the town wants to celebrate Mom." "They might. I think she'd deserve it." "So do I." The words tasted strangely heavy. For the first time, I found myself withholding the truth from my own daughter. Not because I doubted her, because Eleanor had trusted me with a secret that might place Emily in an impossible position before we understood it ourselves. After Emily left, I sat alone in the workshop, staring at the blank journal. The pressed lavender leaf rested where the missing tissue should have been. An ordinary person might have seen only a dried flower. I suddenly noticed something different. One edge had been trimmed perfectly straight. Not by nature. By scissors. Carefully. Deliberately. I held the stem beneath my reading lamp. A narrow shadow appeared along its center. The stem had been split and pressed back together years earlier. Using tweezers, I gently separated the dried fibers. Hidden inside rested a thread so fine it almost disappeared beneath the light. Linen. The same binding thread Eleanor had used throughout the journal. Attached to it was a fragment no larger than my fingernail. Not a page. A tiny corner trimmed from one. Only 2 handwritten characters remained visible. R.H. Rebecca's initials, or someone else's. I didn't know. What I did know was far more troubling. The missing tissue paper had distracted me from the object Eleanor actually expected me to examine. Someone had removed evidence, but I had almost sacrificed my trust in Emily before discovering the truth. I folded the tiny fragment back into the lavender stem and quietly apologized aloud. "I'm learning, Eleanor." Then I began preparing a different plan. one that no longer depended on recovering every missing piece before the exhibition. The day before the Historical Society's exhibition deadline, I stopped trying to recover what had disappeared and began protecting what remained. Years of managing Navy shore facilities had taught me that records became valuable only after they could survive independent verification. Memories faded. Originals could vanish. Proper documentation endured. Eleanor seemed to have understood the same principle long before I did. If the journal had been built to reveal itself slowly, then preserving every recovered impression mattered more than possessing every missing page. Margaret agreed immediately. Instead of reconstructing additional entries, we certified everything already recovered. Each photograph received a dated notation. Every impression was cataloged according to lighting angle, pressure depth, and location within the journal. Margaret signed each page with her conservation credentials before placing them into protective sleeves. Track A had quietly become something stronger. The hidden impressions were no longer simply discoveries. They had become documented evidence. While we worked, Margaret looked up from the final photograph. If Victor truly believes publication honors Eleanor, this documentation gives him one last opportunity. To stop? She nodded. Or to ignore her. That distinction mattered. Justice required choice, not surprise. Late that afternoon, I carried certified copies, not the journal itself, to Victor's office. He welcomed me with genuine warmth. I hoped you'd reconsider. I have. I placed the folder between us. I'd like you to read these first. Victor spent nearly 15 minutes studying the reconstructed impressions. He paused several times, especially at the repeated requests that anonymous gifts remain anonymous. When he reached Eleanor's sentence, "Never tell them my name," he quietly closed the folder. I understand why this concerns you. I was hoping you would. He folded his hands. But I think you're interpreting humility too literally. I waited. Eleanor wanted kindness remembered. Yes, without stories, kindness disappears. His reasoning sounded sincere. That was precisely what made it dangerous. He wasn't arguing against Eleanor. He believed he was completing her work. Then he slid a typed document across his desk, the Historical Society's publication agreement. My signature line already waited at the bottom. I haven't signed anything. I know. We're simply preparing. The words felt harmless. Yet the agreement described a full public reconstruction of Eleanor's journal, complete with exhibition rights, printed editions, and digital archives. Her anonymity would disappear forever. I closed the folder. I'll think about it. Victor smiled. I believe you will. He genuinely believed I was beginning to agree. I let him keep believing it. Driving away, I felt unexpectedly defeated. Had I mistaken good intentions for danger? Would refusing publication erase the very compassion Eleanor hoped would continue? The question stayed with me all evening. What protects kindness better? A name remembered forever, or a promise quietly kept? Just before sunset, Emily arrived carrying an old storage box she had discovered while cleaning our attic. I almost threw this away. Inside rested Eleanor's sewing kit, several family recipes, and one narrow envelope addressed only with my handwriting. Not Eleanor's. Mine. I had completely forgotten it. Years earlier, I had repaired one of Eleanor's journals and tucked spare binding thread inside the envelope for future use. The same pale linen thread. Emily lifted it carefully. "Dad." A tiny paper receipt slipped onto the table. It came from a small stationery shop that had closed decades earlier. Across the bottom, written in Eleanor's unmistakable handwriting, were 5 words. Rebecca Hale received Journal 2 Hale. Not Harris. Not Harper. Margaret Hale. My ally had never once mentioned knowing Rebecca. The exhibition was tomorrow morning. For the first time, I realized the final piece of Eleanor's promise had been sitting beside us from the very beginning. I barely slept the night before the exhibition, not because I feared losing an argument, but because I finally understood the difference between exposing a secret and honoring a trust. Eleanor had never built that journal to accuse anyone. She built it to test whether I would place her wishes above the comfort of public admiration. By sunrise, I knew exactly what I had to do, even if no one else agreed with me. The Historical Society filled quickly. Neighbors who had known Eleanor for decades gathered beneath framed photographs and displays celebrating local volunteers. At the center of the room stood an empty glass case. Victor intended the journal to rest there before the afternoon ended. Margaret arrived carrying our certified documentation. Emily walked quietly beside me. Neither of them knew what I planned to say. Victor greeted us with the confidence of a man who believed the difficult decisions had already been made. "I'm glad you came. So am I. The board is ready. I know." When everyone had taken their seats, Victor stepped to the podium and spoke warmly about preserving ordinary lives that shaped extraordinary communities. Everything he said sounded honorable. Then he invited me forward. I carried only a thin archival folder. The journal remained safely at home. Victor's smile faded almost imperceptibly. "Ladies and gentlemen," I began, "many of you believed my wife left behind a final journal." I paused. She did. Quiet anticipation settled across the room. But she never intended anyone to read it. Several puzzled faces turned toward Victor. I carefully removed the certified photographs instead of the journal itself. Margaret quietly stood beside me. "As a retired professional book conservator," she said, "I certify these reconstructed impressions accurately document the surviving physical evidence." No one interrupted. I continued. Eleanor deliberately removed every written page herself. A murmur spread through the audience. She left only the impressions because she wanted one thing remembered. I read aloud the first recovered sentence. "Never tell them my name." Silence followed. Then another. "Mrs. Alvarez never knew. Please let it stay that way." And another. "The promise isn't finished yet." I never read names connected to the gifts, never described individual acts. Only Eleanor's repeated insistence that compassion survive without recognition. Victor stepped toward me. "Charles, surely people can still be inspired." "I hope they will." "Then let them see the journal." I gently shook my head. The journal isn't the story. Confusion lingered across the room until I unfolded the final certified document. The receipt. The linen thread. The reconstructed index. Everything verified. Everything documented. Then I turned toward Margaret. Years ago, Eleanor entrusted another journal to someone she believed would know when the time was right. Margaret slowly lowered her eyes. Tears appeared before she spoke. My daughter. She looked toward the audience. My daughter, Rebecca. The room remained completely still. Rebecca was dying, Margaret whispered. Eleanor asked her to continue recording anonymous kindness instead of receiving flowers or sympathy. Rebecca had accepted. She continued the journal until her own death. Then Margaret quietly protected it exactly as Eleanor had instructed. No publicity, no recognition, no names. The promise had never been about one journal. It had always been about passing quiet compassion from one ordinary person to another. Victor stared at the evidence spread across the podium. He finally understood. Publication would not preserve Eleanor's legacy. It would erase the very principle she had spent decades protecting. Without accusation, without humiliation, he quietly folded the unsigned publication agreement and slipped it into his briefcase. I withdraw the proposal. No applause followed. None was needed. As neighbors slowly left the hall, several stopped beside the empty display case. Instead of asking where the journal had gone, they asked one another how they might continue Eleanor's tradition without anyone ever knowing their names. Only then did I realize the promise had already found its next caretakers. A week after the exhibition, the town looked exactly the way it always had. Children still hurried through the library after school. Neighbors still waved across front porches. Grocery carts still rolled through familiar aisles. Nothing visible had changed, yet I noticed something Eleanor would have loved. Small acts of kindness began appearing everywhere without explanation. A bag of groceries quietly paid for. Fresh flowers left on a lonely widow's porch. A broken fence repaired before sunrise. Nobody claimed responsibility. Nobody searched for applause. The promise had survived because no one owned it. I never returned the journal to the Historical Society. Instead, Margaret and I placed it inside an acid-free archival box, along with the certified documentation, the pressed lavender leaf, and the tiny paper fragment that had guided us through Eleanor's final lesson. The collection would remain sealed. Not forever. Only until another ordinary caretaker needed to understand why anonymity sometimes protects love better than recognition. Emily visited often after everything ended. One afternoon, she stood beside my workshop, watching me repair the spine of an old family Bible. I finally understand, Mom, she said. I don't think either of us ever completely will. She smiled. Maybe that's the point. Before leaving, she quietly slipped an envelope beneath my coffee mug. Inside rested $50. No note, no signature, only a small receipt from the neighborhood grocery store. Someone's food had already been purchased. I laughed softly. The promise had reached my daughter without anyone asking her to continue it. Margaret visited less frequently as autumn settled across town, yet every conversation became easier. Neither of us spent much time discussing mysteries anymore. The mystery had never been the destination. Learning how to carry it responsibly had been. One cool October morning, she handed me a brand new leather journal. Unlike Eleanor's, every page remained untouched. No hidden impressions this time, she said with a smile. I hope not. What will you write? I opened the cover. For several minutes, I simply looked at the blank paper. Then I remembered something Eleanor once whispered after we finished repairing an old photo album together. Paper isn't important because it lasts, she had said. It's important because someone trusts it. For the first time since her passing, grief no longer felt like an unfinished conversation. It felt like quiet gratitude. I wrote only one sentence on the opening page. Today I helped someone whose name I will never write here. Nothing more. That single sentence felt complete. I closed the journal and placed it beside Eleanor's sealed archive. One journal protected yesterday. The other quietly welcomed tomorrow. If you've stayed with me until these final pages, thank you for sharing this journey. Stories like Eleanor's remind us that the greatest acts of love are often the ones no one ever hears about. If this story touched your heart, I'd be grateful if you subscribed and joined me for more stories of quiet courage, family, dignity, and the ordinary people who change the world without asking to be remembered. And before you go, I'd love to leave you with one simple question. Have you ever received an act of kindness from someone whose name you never learned? Perhaps that's exactly how they hoped you would remember it. I gently switched off the workshop lamp. Outside, evening settled across the neighborhood with the same peaceful silence Eleanor had always loved. For the first time since finding the empty journal, the silence no longer felt empty. It felt full.